Today, we're actually going to start off with one of my freshmen. I'm very proud that she is doing this. She's a wonderful poet. Please give it up for Sydney Tavonnen.
Hello, my name is Sydney, and I wanted to share this poem with you because I worked really hard on it. And it might be a little confusing at first, so I want to just give a disclaimer. This is two people talking. This is not one person. And it is called The Eyes of Optimism and Pessimism. Red as a rose offered a lover, the color of youth's sweet spring, of strawberries growing in the summer, and garnet leaves descending. 'Tis also the color of battle and war, and streams of crimson tears, dripping together down silver swords, forming bloody lakes of fear. Orange is a Thanksgiving cornucopia, carrots in a soup that warm the soul. The comfort of traditions immemorial, harvest plenty and feeling of fall. Fires that burn and crackle are orange, hellish flames dancing in the night. But soon only ashes will remain, blowing away in the morning light. There is nothing like the sun. All life flourishes in its power. It is merry yellow like a smiley face, or Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers. But yet yellow is the color of malaria, mosquito's infernal malady, of dying eyes turning from white to gold, loved ones lost in tropical tragedy. Green is the mark of life on earth, vines and trees and grass just mowed, verdant color of youth and potential. It is the signal for us to go. But green can be repulsive, something putrid, something poison, the smell that fills the air after battle, feasts for buzzards to gorge upon. The azure of Caribbean waters, the indigo of Arctic summer nights, robin's eggs and love's true hearts. Blue means courage and will to fight. Yet blue is the color of sadness too, slumped spines around Picasso's guitars, or the sound of lonely music wafting from Delta or Beale Street bars. Purple is the color of dusk and endings, nightfall covering the weary sky, in sweet crepuscular tranquility, like a blanket shadow's slumbering eyes. But purple too, the robes of tyrants and bruised bodies of those enslaved, crying for only peace and freedom, undisturbed by avarice and graves. You have an evil eye, my friend, you have an evil eye. A bitter heart distorts your sight and makes me wonder why. You wouldn't understand, my friend, I've seen too much to doubt. Good cheer is just false hope, and slings and arrows mount.
Thank you, Sydney. That is fantastic. Yeah, I read that the first time and I was like blown away, and now hearing it again a second time, I'm blown away. It's great. Seniors, you're not going to be here next year. Freshmen, juniors, sophomores, you can do it. You can get up here. You can read something that you've written, and I know for school you've probably written something. So we would love to have you next year. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, let me introduce our next guest. So this is pretty cool because fifth period, I was having trouble figuring out what we were going to do. And then one of my students says, you know, my mom has won multiple story time. Have you ever heard, Mr. Tooley, of the MOTH event? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, yeah, my mom's won like multiple MOTH events. And I'm like, perfect for Writers Week, or Expo. So we got in touch, and I'm really excited about this. Like I said, she's a community member. She's an LHS mom. She's a winning storyteller. She also has a PhD in English literature, so that's just impressive in and of itself. Please welcome Risa McDonnel.
The best thing about moving from Chicago to Hartford when I was 12 was that my grandparents now lived only 2 hours away. The worst thing was everything else. One day, I was a happy Midwestern tomboy who wouldn't be caught dead in a skirt. The next, I was wandering, adrift in a wasteland of pink and green, the target of a preppy middle school death squad who spoke a foreign language I had never heard before. Oxford shirt, Bermuda bag, chinos? And what on God's green earth was with all the little whales all over everything? My tormentors made sure that I learned their language well. Dissected frog parts turned up in my non-Bermuda bag purse during science class. Notes about my decidedly un-chino pants were passed in health ed and caught, accidentally on purpose, because they actually wanted clueless Mr. Doobie to cluelessly read the note out loud so they could snicker when he cluelessly asked, "I don't get it. What's wrong with Risa's pants?" Self-preservation eventually won out over nonconformity. So one day I turned up my collar, tied a whale-covered sweater over my shoulders, and traded my hiking boots for LL Bean duck boots and the hope of a little peace. Wearing a skin that was not my own, of course, accomplished nothing. I would never be one of them, and I didn't really want to. But now I wasn't me anymore, either. I felt like a hermit crab caught between two shells. On clear nights, I would lie awake, hoping for the fickle magic of late-night AM radio waves that sometimes carried Chicago's WLS station impossibly far and into my staticky clock radio. And when it crackled in, just for a moment, I was home. And then the static would reassert itself and I would cry myself to sleep. But it would be okay. It would be okay. It would all be okay if I could just get myself to the game. The Chicago Cubs were playing at Shea Stadium on July 1st, 1980, and I needed to be there. I had been going to games with my father since I was 5, but now Wrigley Field was 900 miles away, and they didn't televise Cubs games in stupid Hartford. And stupid Hartford didn't even have a stupid baseball team, and there was no internet yet in 1980, and there wasn't even any stupid cable because stupid Hartford was such a stupid backwater. All I had were the pathetic box scores in the stupid Hartford newspaper. And Shea Stadium. Just down the expressway from my grandparents' house, a mere 2 hours away, the Cubs would be playing in hostile Mets territory. I could go see them, and I just knew that they would magically sense my presence, and we would bond as fellow refugees, even if theirs was only a temporary exile. We would forge a sympathetic, psychic connection, and for a few hours, I could live in my own skin again. But first I had to get there. My utterly deficient parents had scheduled a client dinner that night. They couldn't take me. They refused to see reason when I suggested taking a train and going all by my 13-year-old self. And I didn't know how to hotwire a car. It was a time of great unrest in the Nystrom household, and I still might not be speaking to them if my very proper, very ladylike granny hadn't offered to take me. The trouble started as soon as we sat down. We had excellent seats, and Granny, to be known henceforth as Poor Granny, said, "Well, we'd better be ready to duck if any pop flies come our way." Duck? There wasn't going to be any ducking. Granny, why do you think I brought my mitt? Poor Granny gave me her best Jewish guilt face. "Young ladies don't go chasing after baseballs." To which I replied, "Then it's a good thing I don't see any young ladies around here." I mean, had she even met me? That was the beginning of the end for poor Granny, because I came to play, armed with my Cubs gear and my big mouth. Some drunken lout a few rows ahead of me made some nasty comments about my Cubs jersey and hat, and he gave me the stink eye every time I urged Bill Buckner to hit it out of the park, or yelled for Dennis Lamp to smoke the batter. Pretty soon I was looking right at the guy, yelling at him as much as I was yelling for the Cubs. Poor Granny noticed. "Sit down and be quiet," she whispered. So I doubled down, I high-fived myself when we scored to go up 1-zip. I danced a vigorous victory dance when we retired the side scoreless. I rooted with all the snotty fervor of a 13-year-old who has been silenced for too long. Eventually, the guy stood up, turned around, pointed at me, and shouted, "Somebody shut that little girl up before I come shut her up." "Risa, I am telling you, sit down and shut up," barked poor Granny, no longer sweet or ladylike. And for the first time in a very long time, I had a choice. I could let this belligerent jackhat bully me the way I had let the kids at school bully me. I could let him tell me that I wasn't in Chicago anymore, that I had to do it his way, that I couldn't wear the clothes I wanted to wear if I wanted to remain unharmed. I could sit down and shut up. Or I could yell, "Oh yeah, you old geezer? I want to see you come make me shut up." And he did. Or at least he tried. He actually got up and started toward me. If I'd had any sense, I would have been scared. But this was no longer about a game. This was personal, and I wasn't going to take it anymore. I brandished the only weapon I had, a large Coke, ready to throw it in his face. Poor Granny looked like she was having a stroke. He kept coming, and 2 uniformed police officers appeared out of nowhere and hauled his sorry butt away. I was now ready to sit down and shut up, and the second inning could begin. When the Cubs eventually won, because of course they won, those same officers appeared and asked if they could escort us to our car. Apparently, my would-be attacker was a well-known drug dealer who had been under surveillance for quite some time. By threatening me, he gave the police an excuse to detain him, and New York's finest were worried that this gentleman's associates might not take kindly to my interference. They wanted to make sure no one followed us out to the parking lot. That was it for poor Granny. We rode home in utter silence, and when we got there, she poured herself a stiff scotch and shoved me toward my parents in a most unladylike manner, snarling, "Next year, you take her." I didn't care. My superpower had just been revealed to me. I was a Cubs fan, and not just any Cubs fan. I was a crime-fighting Cubs fan. That's who I was, had always been, and always would be. That sad exile wandering around the pink and green tundra of Hartford? That wasn't me. She was just my secret identity. And armed with that knowledge, I knew that it would be okay. It would be okay. It would all be okay. Thank you. Get quickly through some slides. I may ask you guys some questions along the way, and I'm going to leave some time for Q&A, during which you can ask me about anything, the story itself, performing, storytelling, MOTH, anything from the content in the PowerPoint itself. The first thing I want to do is, by a show of hands, how many of you thought that was a story about a baseball game? Wow. All right. How many of you thought that was a story about being the new kid? Okay. How many of you thought it was a story about bullying? All right. What else do you guys think that might have been a story about? You can shout it out. Sorry? Good. Anything else? Mm-hmm. Good. Identity. Mm-hmm. Okay. Courage. Yep. So the point here is this is a story about a lot of different things, and that's really what's at the core of what makes good storytelling and what makes storytelling important. Because you can have 500 people in an audience hearing the same story, and they will each experience it differently, and thus, even if only in a nuanced way, they will think it's about something different than the person on their left and the person on their right. And that's good, because stories are about human experience. Why do we tell stories? Duh. But why do we find a good story so entertaining? Because they give meaning to our personal experiences. Life comes at us constantly, every minute of every day. We experience more in 1 hour than we can possibly process, let alone in 1 week, 1 month, 1 lifetime. So stories are a way for us to pick and choose the parts of our lives that are important. And it's a way to organize them so that we can process them. It means we get to own our own lives. We get to own what impacts us, what doesn't impact us. We get to prioritize, and telling stories is one of the ways that we make that happen. They also help us recognize common experiences. I chose this story today because even though I wasn't in high school yet when it happened, I thought it might be something that you all would have some common understanding of. Maybe you've been bullied. Maybe you've been a bully. Maybe you've been the new kid. Maybe you are a baseball fan. There are all kinds of ways in which you might connect with this story. You probably wouldn't have connected so much with a story about being a mom baking cupcakes for her son's kindergarten birthday, right? So connection, finding something in common. At the same time, they teach us new information and new perspectives. I could have told you a story today about hiking up a volcano. You would have learned an awful lot about Stromboli, Italy, Lord of the Rings, the Aeolian Sea, all kinds of new information, and who knows, maybe some of that might have even been useful on a literature test or a history test or even a science test. Fact is, it would have been new information, and yet you still would have found a common experience and a way to connect into it. In short, stories are what humanize us. I'm just going to hold this. Did you ever wonder why superheroes' alter egos are so dysfunctional, sort of like that sad little girl in the Pink and Green Wasteland? It's because they can't share their best stories with anybody. They have to keep it all in. Think about it. Now, I'm old school, so my favorite Batman movie is the first one with Michael Keaton way back when. And if you've seen that movie, you'll understand what I mean when I say, if you had just tossed the Joker into a huge vat of acid and watched a man melt, you might have a lot of big feelings about that. You might be really jubilant because you just vanquished the Joker and saved Gotham City, but you might also be feeling horror at what you had to do in order to save Gotham City. You might be feeling confusion about why it came down to this and why Gotham City couldn't protect itself. All kinds of big feelings. You wouldn't be able to share them with anybody. You wouldn't be able to go home and say, guess what I just did? Let me tell you this great story. Can't share their worst stories with anyone either, for the same reason. And therefore, they can't share their true selves with anyone. Superman is Superman, and Clark Kent is really his disguise. But he can't let anybody know who he really is. So he can't establish trust with people. He can't establish emotional connection with people because he's always hiding who he really is. When it's done well, storytelling gives us all superpowers that connect us to the people around us. Persuasion. We see this all the time in advertisements, don't we? Poor little Hector has no food and no clothes, and he lives in a tent, but he's got big brown eyes and a big sister who's trying to take care of him. Makes a lot of people want to dig deep into their pockets, right? If the commercial had just said, there's a famine going on, let's dig in deep in our pockets, you wouldn't get as much money, would you? Marketing is all about stories. It's all about creating a story to tell so that you can imagine yourself using the product. Organized thought is another superpower storytelling gives us. Remember what I just said about how everything comes at us so constantly that we can't possibly process it all, and we can't possibly prioritize it all, or give it all equal weight, I should say? say you're writing a history paper and you've done all your research and you've got stacks and stacks of quotes and facts and data, and you're sitting at your computer at 2 in the morning because you just don't know where to start with it all or how to put it into an order that makes sense. If you are used to telling stories and you're used to actually thinking about how you craft them, then you know how to sift through and start making order and sense of it. And maybe you'll even have a story to tell that's relevant to the material. Maybe you're writing a paper about the Nuremberg trials, and maybe you just happened to go to Nuremberg, Germany on vacation the previous summer. You probably have a story that you can tell to give yourself an entry point into your paper. Conflict resolution. Just as superheroes can't share themselves with people, we can. And when we have disagreements with people, telling stories and getting to know the other person on a deeper level is one of the first ways of creating common connection, so we can look beyond the conflict and start looking at what we have in common. Leadership. Now, I don't want to get into religious stuff, and I don't mean this in a religious way, just in a literary, historical, or religious way, depending on how you look at things. What did Jesus do? He told parables. Adaptability. We adjust our stories for different audiences or different agendas. I've told this story at MOTH slams before, and I guarantee you I told it quite differently. And it probably also had different language in it. I may not have used the word stupid about Hartford so many times, but we are not in front of a fully adult audience. But if you have to adjust your story for different audiences, what you're really learning is to read the room. You're learning to adapt to the circumstances. You're also, again, learning to pick and choose what's important in the given moment on the fly. So that's also improvisation. Confidence. The more we tell our own stories, the more we own what happens to us instead of letting it own us. And to the extent that you might find yourself interested in storytelling like this, where you're up on a stage or in some other performance venue, then you also develop the confidence of standing up on a stage and using your voice. It just does all kinds of things for how you carry yourself in front of other people and how you take advantage of leadership opportunities. And finally, problem solving. When you write a story, again, you're trying to pick and choose and arrange and order and create a story that does what you want it to. It almost never does what you want it to. And so you need to spend time reordering, deciding what's important. Maybe your story's too long. If you do a MOTH slam story, you get 5 minutes, and then you get the hook if you're not done. So I've written many MOTH stories to go do at a slam, and they've all been too long, and I've had to figure out how to hack back and understand what is the most important content and what do I not need to have in there. All those kinds of decisions, by the way, are solving problems. My problem is it's too long. My problem is it's not communicating what I want it to. My problem is the only way I can think of to get this across is using some language I don't want to use. We solve problems. Okay, so what makes it a story? You could go to college and major in creative writing and spend 4 years and still not have a definitive, complete answer. So we're going to be really 30,000-foot view today. At its most basic, beginning, middle, and end. But we don't have to start at the beginning, and we don't have to start at the end, and we probably shouldn't unless we're writing War and Peace. You will notice I did not start my story by saying, in 1979, my father took a new job in Hartford, Connecticut, and we had to move, and I hated my school, blah, 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 blah. You'll also notice I didn't end by going back to school with my newfound voice and confidence. Those things did not matter for my purposes for this story. Okay, fine, beginning, middle, end. My term paper had a beginning, middle, end. That didn't make it a story. Excellent point. Then let's talk about story versus plot, with apologies to E.M. Forster if any of you have read his novels. Story I moved from Chicago to Hartford, and then my grandmother took me to a baseball game. This is a sequence of events. At its core, a story is a sequence of events that make up the beginning, middle, and end. But when you simply put some events down on paper, what's left to say? Where's the story here? Do you even care about reading any further? Plot is when you take those events and you craft it accordingly. Again, picking and choosing what to leave in, what to take out, but also what happens, how does it build on each other, what information do you give now, what information do you give later? That's the plot. I moved from Chicago to Hartford, and then my grandmother took me to a baseball game so I wouldn't feel so homesick. Now we have causality. We understand what caused her to take me to the baseball game. At the same time, it also raises questions. Why was I homesick? Why was a baseball game going to cure that? Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what makes it a story. What makes it a good story? Because is this plot enough to make you care that my grandmother took me to a baseball game, knowing that she took me so I wouldn't be homesick? No, because a story also needs characters who give life to the plot's events, give motivation, emotional response, personality, consequences to the events that happen, all kinds of things. Okay, but here we're talking about personal storytelling. We're talking about telling our own stories. Aren't characters fiction? Isn't that something you make up? What if I'm telling a true story? It doesn't have characters. Just because the people in a true story exist in real life does not mean they are not characters in your story. Everyone in your story is a character. That story was about me, but it certainly wasn't about the 55-year-old me who's standing in front of you now. It was about a 13-year-old me, and only one version of a 13-year-old me. There are many versions of every person, and as a storyteller, you get to choose which version you're going to use in your story and why you're going to use it. A good story makes you ask questions so that you keep listening or reading to find the answers. Makes you care enough about the characters that you want to ask the questions in the first place. But some questions are best left unanswered because... All right, let's move on and talk about when isn't it a story? Oh, wait, you wanted to know why some answers are best left unanswered? Some questions are best left unanswered right away, because deferred gratification is what gives you suspense. Some are best answered not at all, because they don't need to be there, and readers like to fill in their own thoughts in some of the blanks. It makes them feel smart. They never like to be over-explained to. So I never explain in this story what happens when I go back to school. Did I go back and suddenly I had a lot of friends because of my new voice? Did I go back and I was still miserable, but I had a tool for dealing with it? Or did I go back and my newfound confidence got squashed in week 1? It doesn't matter. That wasn't the point of the story. And again, less is more when it comes to detail. We don't need to start with the day I was born in Evanston Hospital. All right, now, when isn't it a story? When it's an essay. I go to MOTH story slams, and you're supposed to get up and spend 5 minutes telling an actual story. And instead, we get people sometimes who stand up and they talk about what's important to them. There was somebody recently, a young woman, who stood up and talked about being an undocumented immigrant and what that meant to her. And it was brilliant and lovely and moving, and we all enjoyed it. But it was an essay about immigration policy. It was not a story. A eulogy. Similarly, I remember someone getting up and saying, "Oh, I love my grandmother. I grew up next door to her, and I'd go over there all the time after school when my parents were working, and she was my hero, and I'm just so happy I got to have that close relationship with her before she died." Again, lovely, not a story. when it's a debate. I'm standing here to tell you why Google is evil personified. Not a story. Neither are any of these. But you can use storytelling to make any of these more effective, except maybe the rant. All right, let's talk about some more specific applications of how we use storytelling as a tool. College application essays. I often tutor kids who are working on theirs, and this summer I had a young man who got into all of his top choices, by the way, who wrote an essay about working in a rug warehouse, an Oriental rug warehouse. And he thought that he was going to be a cashier running the front desk, and he showed up on the first day in chinos and a buttoned collared shirt, only to discover he was going to be working in the warehouse. Now, this was not a story about rugs. He was writing an essay in which he wanted to convey that he understood his privilege as an upper middle class Caucasian young man going to a private school. He wanted to convey his deep love of music and his experience with the choir program in his church. He wanted to convey his love of history and his interest in studying it. And he wanted to convey the fact that as somebody who went to a Catholic high school, he had a particular relationship with religion. But he chose to write about working in the rug warehouse to do that because it was a story around which he could frame all of this information. If he had just written an essay that said, you know, I'm so lucky to be who I am and be born where I was and to have these experiences in going to England to sing with my choir, and I have a work ethic. Dime a dozen. Job interviews. You will always, always, always in a job interview be asked, tell me about one of your greatest successes or one of your greatest failures. My favorite story for a job interview is a failure story in which I had my first annual review, my first year out of college, and thought I was going to slam it, and instead it was really bad and I almost got fired. So I have a great story for another time about how I handled that, and it's something that I have used over and over and over again in my life when I have had conflicts to deal with. Another example is college interviews, by the way, for those of you coming up on it. When I interview, I do alumni interviews for my alma mater, and I ask people, what is your biggest accomplishment in high school? I'm so proud that I took all AP classes and I got such good grades and I did so many activities. 90% of the time. When I interviewed for college, I told the story about becoming the editor of my high school paper and realizing the budget hadn't been raised in 10 years and lobbying the Board of Education and getting the budget tripled. Which do you think is going to get you in? Sales. This one is pretty self-explanatory, right? Science. Storytelling is important in science. Data is just numbers. The story that you tell from the data is what makes the data important. Sports broadcasting. Did we root for St. Pete's during the NCAA tournament because they were the underdog? There are always underdogs. Why did we root for them? Because it was a great story. And yet again, was it? Or did the sports broadcasters turn it into a great story? Little of both, I think. All right, last slide. Final thoughts for you to take away in your own storytelling. Keep it real. Tell your own stories. Sure, sometimes we say to somebody, oh, gee, Mom, did you hear about this guy who did this really cool thing? But it's not really your story, so it doesn't have as much impact. Whoops. Less is more. No one has time to hear your entire life story. Just focus on the good parts. And by good parts, I mean the parts that make your case in your story, not necessarily only the good things that happened to you. Have a purpose in mind. Why are you telling the story? You don't have to communicate that purpose explicitly, but you have to know what it is in order to create a story that will do it. Listen and look around. The best stories come from unexpected places. I won a moth slam by telling a story about having to take my kid's pet lizard to the vet. Sorry. Get out there. Tell your stories. do some moth slams, do some shows. The only failed stories are the ones you don't tell. And finally, whoops, sorry, I forgot to animate this slide. My tech skills are not as good as my storytelling skills. Everyone has a story to tell. Let me repeat that. Everyone has a story to tell. Okay, questions?
I actually have a question.
Sure.
The one that you read at the beginning of the period, I know you said you revised that for this audience. When you initially sat down to write it, how long would you say the whole process took from beginning to end? I'm sure it wasn't like a one-time deal.
Oh, no. I mean, and you raised a good point, by the way, there is spontaneous storytelling. We do it all the time, right? You go home from school, and unless you're the kind of kid that when your mom says, "How was your day?" you go, "Fine," and go up to your room, you'll say, "Oh, you would not believe what happened in the lunchroom today." That's impromptu storytelling, and it's important too. This kind of storytelling, you really have to know, again, why you're telling it, how you're telling it, what you're trying to accomplish with it. So it's like any other piece of writing. It probably takes me a couple of days just to write a draft, and then I revise it several times. And that one I was actually revising on my way to the story slam. And that one, by the way, I was not allowed to read. I had to tell it from memory. So that's the other thing about stories. They evolve every time you tell them, even if you don't intend for them to, because there's no way you're going to get up and tell it without notes. I tell it exactly the same way each time. And it's good to learn that that's okay. They're not rigid, fixed forms. Any other questions?
Can you tell students how the MOTH slam works? Because I think
Yeah.
quite a few of them don't know.
Absolutely. So I don't know if any of you have heard of the MOTH Radio Hour. It's on NPR. I highly recommend it, and you can stream it on their website. But aside from the stories that get on the radio, the MOTH has story slams. They're like poetry slams, for those of you who know what those are. And they have them in cities all over the world on a monthly basis. And each month there's a theme. And you are invited to develop a story that is no longer than 5 minutes on that theme, however you think it fits that theme. And if you want to tell your story, you show up to the show and you put your name in a hat. They will pick 10. You might not get to tell your story. You might tell your story. You might have to go first. You might have to go last. It's kind of a toss-up kind of a thing. Now, they also ask audience members to form judging panels. So there are 3 judging panels who rate your story on a scale of 1 to 10. So after each story, we get the score, and at the end of the evening, they crown a winner based on who gets the highest score. You have to tell it without anything in your hands. You have to tell it from memory. You're not allowed to have props, and it has to be your story. Other than that, anything goes. I believe that anyone can tell a story. Most of the slams are held in bars or clubs. So if you're under 21, you have to bring a parent. But actually, one of the best slam stories I ever saw was told by a 14-year-old girl whose parents brought her, and she got up and talked about her battle with anorexia. I had to follow her. It was not my best night. Anything else? Yes. My suggestion would be sit down and don't even think too hard. It's what's called free writing, where you just write without worrying about what's coming out of your pen. And just write a list of what you think are the most interesting things about yourself. And then play with a few of them. Like, eventually you'll only pick one. Play with them and shoot for a narrow story. You do not want to be telling them everything you can cram in there. You want to have a narrow framework and then figure out how to pack in details that speak for themselves. So, thanks, guys. It was fun.